Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We have been handed an absolutely profound and I think truly critical body of work here.
Hmm.
I mean, this material, it doesn't just ask us to look at the foundations of faith and morality. It demands that we surgically separate what is eternal and necessary from,
Well,
well, from what's temporary and just distracting.
right.
Our mission in this deep dive is to find that timeless ethical core of spiritual principles and, distinguish it from the cultural shell, all those layers of tradition and misinterpretation that have just piled up over centuries.
And what's fascinating here, I mean, just from the get-go, is the sheer audacity of it. The breadth of the context provided is just staggering.
It really is.
We are not just analyzing the stories of prophets like Nuh, Hud, and Musa in a vacuum. We are linking fundamental concepts of physics like entropy, the universal decay of matter.
Directly to sociology and ancient history.
Exactly. And spiritual philosophy, the scope is huge. It goes all the way from the Paleolithic era, the dawn of human consciousness, right through to the complex political structures of, say, Sasanian culture. It's almost like a scientific diagnosis of spiritual decay.
It's a complete holistic picture. I mean, we're using textual analysis of Scripture right alongside historical and biological insights to really dig into key concepts. Things like melee,
A self-proclaimed elite.
right, and Tokfa, which you'll see the source is completely redefined for us.
Mm.
To use that beautiful metaphor for the material, our goal is to find the ember, the cause of truth that's burning deep inside tradition, rather than just carrying the ash, the cool of the past. Because the ash is heavy, it's obstructive, and it's dead.
And if you only carry the ash, you've completely missed the whole point of the fire in the first place.
Exactly.
And if we want to understand how that ash even accumulates, we have to start with the most fundamental law governing the entire universe,
Which is?
the impossibility of perfect permanence.
Okay, so let's start there. Section 1.
The material kicks off with a claim that just resets your entire perspective. It says everything, and I mean everything without exception, is subject to death and entropy.
So this is a direct philosophical nod to the second law of thermodynamics, right?
It is the universal, relentless flow from order to disorder. It's just an inescapable physical reality.
And to ground this, I mean, this is a colossal concept that the whole cosmos is winding down. The sources use this stunning example of physical decay that exists at the most minute level we can even measure.
Yeah, they do. They point out that even the most stable, foundational subatomic particles, like the proton, are not immortal.
They have a lifespan.
They have a calculated lifespan. It's estimated to be incredibly vast, billions upon billions of years. But it is finite. It will end.
And that's a crucial point for context, isn't it? Because when you look at the periodic table, you see this beautiful order in the elements, all arranged by their proton count: hydrogen with 1, helium with 2, all the way up to 118.
It represents this incredible cosmic order. And yet, the physics itself suggests that even that fundamental stability is temporary. When you really absorb that truth, that the core building blocks of reality itself are decaying, it puts all our little human obsessions into a really stark relief.
So the sources established this universal law of impermanence right from the start. The earth will die, the sun will die, the moon will die. Everything physical is mortal. And the text, Kululea Fan, confirms it. Everything upon the earth perishes. Only the essence, the zat of the Lord, is eternal.
And by beginning there, they set this incredible benchmark. If even physical reality is subject to decay, how much faster must our human, social, and spiritual structures decay if we don't actively maintain them?
And that lack of maintenance, that spiritual decay, it often begins when our own human cultural concepts just seep into and ultimately corrupt divine theology.
Precisely. And the sources draw a very specific historical line here. They highlight what they call the Sasanian shadow.
This shadow is cast by the political arrangement of the late ancient period, right? There's this insightful claim, though they admit it's speculative, that the phrase "intellect is the prophet within you," which is often attributed to Imam Kafir.
Might have cultural roots in a Sasanian political concept.
Exactly.
And that concept was used by the Zoroastrian fire worshippers of the time to describe their rulers. Dulula fill ours God's shadow on earth.
And this wasn't just some respectful title, was it?
Not at all. In the Sasanian Empire, this phrase was foundational to a very specific political pact. They summarized it with the phrase Tamdin ve devletim.
Which means, roughly.
Religion and state are interdependent. They need each other to survive.
So unpack that interdependence for us. How did that political arrangement specifically corrupt the theological outlook?
Well, the Sasanian system was symbiotic. The ruler, the so-called shadow of God, would legitimize the established religious priests by giving them tax exemptions, land, authority, all the perks.
And in return,
In return, the priests would empower the ruler, declaring his kingship to be divinely sanctioned and therefore completely unquestionable.
it's a system designed for mutual benefit and control.
Yes, creating a closed ruling elite. And when this cultural model where political and religious power just constantly reinforce and validate each other leaks into later theology, it blurs the line. It blurs the line between a divine mandate for justice and just simple human political ambition and control.
It makes faith a tool for maintaining a social hierarchy.
Exactly. And that system of elite control is what gives rise to the great intellectual and spiritual danger the sources call takantular.
Fixations, obsessions.
Obsessions. If the focus is on maintaining that privileged cultural structure, then the actual ethical core of the faith just gets lost in all the minutiae.
And that is the danger of fixating on the cultural shell. When people prioritize the political or the cultural identity markers of their faith, they start to obsess over these non-essential details.
And the sources give some amazing examples of this misplaced energy, fixating on the specific color of your clothing or the purity of a certain fabric, or even believing that specific shades of color are linked directly to God or, on the flip side, to Satan.
These things are peripheral, they're distracting, and they're totally irrelevant to justice or responsibility.
It's an intellectual hazard that prevents any true perspective. And the sources illustrate this with a really powerful image.
The matchstick.
Holding a matchstick right up to your eye obscures the entire forest behind it.
And the matchstick might be that specific religious symbol or ritual. It's small, it's easily defined, it's comforting to focus on.
Right, but by obsessing over the color of that matchstick, or whether you hold it this way or that way, you are completely missing the vast ethical landscape. The forest, that includes societal ethics, justice, planetary responsibility, human dignity.
And worse, if you drop the flame from that matchstick because you're careless or arrogant.
You can cause the spiritual forest fire itself. The obsession with the small thing actively destroys the big thing.
And that obsession, it often spirals into what the sources call a state of spiritual drunkenness, or sohusluk.
And this is not, intoxication from alcohol. It's a self-induced moral blindness. An absurd reliance on extreme superstition precisely because your intellect and your sense of responsibility have been outsourced.
The consequences are, they're tragically comical, aren't they?
They are. The sources cite superstitions that just show how far the human mind will go to avoid accountability. We're talking about beliefs like a follower thinking a sheikh has the power to transfer them directly to heaven using a simple matchbox.
A transactional bypass of the entire ethical struggle.
Totally. Or the absurd idea that through some prayer or a special word, you can just command angels to perform menial tasks, like cleaning a stable for you.
So you're treating the spiritual realm not as a source of guidance, but as this infinite, subservient labor force for your own trivial earthly tasks.
And maybe the most telling example of this materialization of spirituality is the pursuit of transactional safety. The idea that by buying a specially prepared, very expensive, fireproof shroud, you can somehow guarantee your safety in the grave.
It reflects a deep-seated human fear of accountability, combined with a willingness to just pay to bypass any ethical effort.
The transaction itself is fraudulent, of course, but the buyer is in this state of spiritual drunkenness, and they're unable to recognize the absurdity of trying to purchase salvation.
That impulse to moralize, to force these strict human ethical codes onto what is essentially an amoral universe, that's part of this rigidity, isn't it?
It is. There's that anecdote about some people citing anthropologists who claim to see monkeys stoning one of their own for adultery.
And this is then used as proof that moral responsibility exists even in nature, which validates their own strict legalism.
Right. But this path leads very quickly to truly nonsensical checks. Like the example of the spiritually drunken person who starts to worry about the origin of their daily food. They feel this compulsion to verify if the chicken that laid their egg or the cow that provided their milk was married under the proper religious rites.
And if you follow that logic to its conclusion, you just end up questioning the legitimacy and purity of every single egg and every drop of milk. You paralyze yourself with irrelevant questions.
It's an unsustainable, convoluted, and completely distracting path. And it stems directly from forcing human cultural rules onto biological processes, instead of focusing on true, practical ethics. Like
I-
treating the cow well and feeding your neighbor.
The moment you find yourself asking those kinds of questions.
You've succumbed to the dealer.
Yeah.
You're prioritizing the ash over the ember.
So the response to this spiritual drunkenness and rigidity has to be a wholesale shift toward flexibility, toward continuous learning and adaptation. And the sources capture this perfectly in their profound redefinition of life and death.
It's a striking formulation.
So the traditional definition of death, the cessation of breath, is just dismissed here as insufficient.
The sources offer a far more profound and maybe unsettling criterion for judging our own existence.
Which is?
Death is defined as ceasing to learn. Ölmek öğrenmemektir. This fundamentally links our spiritual vitality to our intellectual activity, to our curiosity. If you stop seeking knowledge, if you stop growing, if you stop engaging with the complexity of the world around you, you are, in this sense, already spiritually dead, regardless of your physical pulse.
And the complement to that is the definition of aging. It's also redefined not by chronology, but by rigidity.
Aging is the inability to change. Yaşlanmak değişmemektir. To be truly young is to be adaptive, open, and flexible. To be old in this context is to be spiritually rigid and just fixed in your ways.
And you see this playing out every day. You have individuals who are chronologically young, say 18, 20 years old, who have already decided they're finished, they've settled their views, they've stopped changing, and so they're dry.
And conversely, you meet people who are 80 and they are still fresh, lively, constantly evolving their ideas because they remain wet and adaptive.
The tree analogy in the sources captures this so beautifully. A dry tree is just firewood, done. Its potential is exhausted, its utility is singular and fixed.
But a wet, fresh tree is alive, Kenley. It has growth potential. It contributes to the ecosystem, and it can bend in the wind without snapping.
We have to remain wet. We have to remain adaptive.
And if we accept that constant learning and change are the true measures of life, it completely changes how we approach our most sacred sources of knowledge. It moves us away from treating revelation as some rigid, singular fact book and towards seeing it as an active guide to greater consciousness.
Which leads us directly into Section 2, where we have to address this common mistake of misplacing the Scripture's actual function.
The sources present a paradigm shift here that I think is revolutionary for many listeners. They argue that the Quran's purpose is emphatically not to be a standalone, comprehensive source of all scientific or historical or biological information. It's just not the primary text.
It's the helper, the guide, the pointer. It's the auxiliary text, the Yardımcı Kitap. So if it's auxiliary, what are the primary books we're supposed to be reading?
The primary books, the Asıl Kitab, according to these sources, are the three great repositories of divine wisdom. The Book of the Universe, Kainat,
Cosmos.
the Book of Nature, Doza, and the Book of Man, Insan. The Quran serves to guide our consciousness toward the profound information that's contained within those three primary ongoing sources.
And that's a powerful distinction because it forces us to use our intellect and our physical senses. If the universe is the primary book, then a geologist is essentially reading a sacred text.
Right. And if nature is the primary book, a biologist is reading scripture.
And this is where the finger analogy becomes so vital.
The scripture acts like a finger pointing toward the ultimate truth. The facts of history, the processes of biology, the laws of physics, the dynamics of sociology. It is a signpost. It is not the destination.
And the danger, the great disloyalty, is when we fixate on the finger itself instead of looking where it's pointing. If the goal is the truth, let's say the moon, and we only look at the messenger, the finger, we've misunderstood the entire directive.
You have to engage directly with the universe and with humanity to extract knowledge, because that's what the scripture itself instructs you to do.
And the ultimate transformation is the goal, right? The distinction between bilgin, information, raw data, and bilins, consciousness or wisdom.
It's a crucial distinction. The Quran's true aim is not to make you merely knowledgeable, bilgin, capable of just retaining facts and verses by rote. Its goal is to make you wise, bilge, to provide genuine wisdom, hikmet, that transforms how you interact with the world.
And the sources prove this by pointing directly to explicit scriptural directives.
The directives are unambiguous. Verses like Gashi 17:20 and Ankabut 20 explicitly instruct us. Wander the earth and observe how creation began.
It doesn't say read this book to find out. It says go look.
Exactly. We are told, look at the camel to learn about the camel, and look at the sky to learn about the sky. The imperative is to look outside the text, into the world.
So if the ultimate goal was to provide all knowledge within the cover of one book, the directive would be, come to me to learn about creation.
But it's not. It's a command for scientific inquiry, for historical study. It demands that we conduct archaeological and paleontological digs to find the millions of years of hidden verses of creation that are stored in the rock strata right beneath our feet. A 300-million-year-old fossil is a verse from the book of nature.
And this understanding brings a really sharp, necessary critique of these modern religious attempts to impose contemporary scientific discoveries back onto the ancient texts.
Oh yes, it's what we see when people claim they can find quantum physics hidden in the Quran, or when they speculate about advanced technology like cell phones being on Noah's Ark.
This isn't just misguided. It fundamentally misunderstands the dignity and the purpose of the revelation.
It's the equivalent of demanding that a beautiful, profound poem written to elevate the human spirit should also function as a calculus textbook.
It's using the wrong tool for the job.
The two serve entirely different purposes, and by forcing them to serve the same purpose, you diminish both. Which brings us to the honeybee analogy.
Okay.
The Quran is likened to a honeybee, a bal arisha, that produces the finest sustenance, which is honey, a refined, complex, life-giving product of nature.
So if you attempt to load the Quran with scientific burdens, trying to make it carry the weight of all human history and all future science,
You are treating the bee like a beast of burden, like a donkey or a mule. You're expecting the bee to carry a heavy load. And the attempt is futile, and in a way, it's deeply insulting to the revelation's true purpose. The bee produces wisdom. It is not meant to carry data.
and if we approach the text with the wrong expectation, as a history book, a science manual, a political charter, we risk experiencing that dual effect the sources mention.
Right, Shifa versus Husran.
Healing versus disappointment.
The revelation provides healing and consciousness, Shifa, for those who accept it as a guide to practical ethics and wisdom. But it increases the profound disappointment and the broken hopes, the Husran, for those who approach it with the wrong expectations.
Because they look for scientific formula and they don't find them, and then they conclude the book is outdated.
When in reality, their expectations were just misplaced from the very start.
Okay, so if the purpose of revelation is to cultivate wisdom and consciousness, we have to identify the forces that actively oppose it. And the source material offers a really nuanced, essential redefinition of Satan, or Shaitan.
Yeah, we really need to move past the external literalistic image of some horned creature acting in the shadows. The material suggests that this externalization is itself a distraction from the real struggle.
So where is Satan found?
In two principal places. Externally, yes, in those people who persistently spread evil and corruption. But most crucially, internally, in our own internal drives, are Gudeler and Detruler.
And the drives identified are fear, anger, and lust, or Shivet. These are powerful, necessary, primal survival instincts.
Exactly. They're not inherently evil. But when these drives manage us, when we are driven purely by unchecked fear or uncontrolled rage or insatiable lust, they become our internal Satan. They lead us astray and corrupt our ethical judgment.
The internal landscape of the individual is where the war for the soul is truly fought.
It is. But what's fascinating, and I think really hopeful, is the insight that these forces can be transformed.
How so?
When we manage and govern these same drives, when we exercise consciousness and control, they transform into blessings, into nimet. Our fear, when it's controlled, becomes security and prudence. Our anger, when controlled, fuels justice and the pursuit of righteousness. Our desire, when controlled, fuels creativity and healthy relationships.
So our internal management, or lack thereof, determines whether these inherent drives serve as security measures or as destructive forces.
That's it.
And this focus on internal psychological guidance is reinforced by the deliberate structuring of the sacred narratives, the qasas, which are so clearly not interested in chronological history.
The sources are very clear on this. The purpose of the narratives is moral guidance, not historical record. For example, in the chapter of the poets, Surah Shuara, the story of Musa is recounted chronologically before that of Ibrahim.
Even though Ibrahim lived about 1,000 years earlier, Ibrahim is placed around 2300 BC, tied to the collapse of Sumer. Musa is around 1300 BC. If the aim were history, this order would be a glaring error.
But because the aim is guidance, the order is intentional, and we see this even more clearly in the story of Adam and Iblis, which appears 7 times throughout the text. And crucially, none of the 7 versions are identical.
Each version focuses on a different facet to deliver a specific moral guidance, a specific uzut.
Yes. One version might emphasize Adam's repentance. Another, Satan's crushing arrogance. A third, Adam's superiority due to knowledge. The variation is a feature, designed to elicit different lessons depending on the context of the surrounding verses and the audience's needs at that moment.
This highlights the absolute need for what the sources call the correct metric. If we judge Revelation by the standards of a historical textbook, true or false, we will misunderstand its purpose entirely.
Think of it this way. A historical book is judged by its factual accuracy, but a painting is judged by whether it is aesthetic or unaesthetic. We have to apply the correct measure.
You wouldn't criticize a beautiful, morally complex, epic poem for not having footnotes in a bibliography?
You wouldn't. Revelation must be judged by its effectiveness in providing guidance, cultivating consciousness, and establishing ethical boundaries.
And this approach is supported by profound classical scholarship. The sources cite the interpretation of Bilhak or With Truth by Zamashri.
Zamashri, a renowned 11th century scholar from Central Asia, clarified that the stories are presented with a sahi, or correct, aim, and that aim is guidance, consciousness, and setting ethical boundaries. The truth is in the moral lesson, not necessarily in the precise chronological or archaeological detail.
And this is how we pivot away from the cultural baggage and find that core wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
But if the goal is consciousness, the greatest obstacle to achieving it, especially on a societal scale, is the structural arrogance of the elite.
And that takes us to Section 3. When we study the narratives of Nuh and Hud, we find they are not just spiritual battles, they are incredibly powerful social critiques. The conflict is drawn specifically between the prophet and the melee.
Melee, a fascinating term. It literally means full or overflowing, those who have surpassed their limits, often by virtue of wealth and power.
It acts as the sociological identifier for the elite, the privileged ruling class. Historically, this corresponds to the division between the Havas, the select, the special people, and the Avam, the commoners.
And the sources argue that any society that is structurally split into Havas and Avam is inherently a class society designed to maintain inequality and exclusivity.
And this structural division gives rise to two completely opposing theological worldviews: the Kibir Theologisi, or the theology of arrogance, and the Takva Theologisi, the theology of responsibility.
So the theology of arrogance, Kibir, is defined by external metrics.
Completely. It measures superiority using visible cultural markers, wearing special religious clothes like a specific kuba or kippah, excessive or highly visible public prayer, or the number of expensive pilgrimages you've undertaken. This entire superficial structure exists explicitly to deny the core ethical demand of takva.
Which means, to access that wisdom, we have to strip away centuries of cultural baggage and redefine takva. Historically, it's often been reduced to ritualistic piety or din darlik, how often you pray or fast.
And that reduction is precisely the problem. The sources redefine takva fundamentally as responsibility consciousness, sorumlu bilinci, and ethics, akhlaq. It has absolutely nothing to do with whether you are ritually pious.
Responsibility consciousness. That sounds incredibly broad. What does it actually demand of an individual?
It demands an active, engaged responsibility to uphold the rights of everything in your environment: the river, the soil, the animals, other human beings, and crucially, your own self.
So a person who prays 5 times a day, who maintains this outward appearance of piety, but who pollutes the river or neglects the rights of their employees.
Fundamentally not a mutaki. They are not practicing takva. Their piety is superficial. It's a symptom of kibir.
This brings us to a devastating modern critique highlighted in the sources: the washing machine effect.
This effect describes the cynical, transactional use of ritual to cleanse moral corruption. It is the belief that by engaging in a large ritualistic act, say a highly publicized, expensive pilgrimage like Hajj one, can effectively wash clean millions of dollars that were stolen via corruption or bribery or embezzlement.
So you climb Mount Arafat with pockets full of illicit money, expecting to be spiritually reset to zero, fully absolved of all your societal and ethical crimes.
It's a complete spiritual delusion, a failure of responsibility consciousness that believes ritual volume can somehow outweigh an ethical vacuum.
And the sources offer a fascinating psychological insight into the root cause of this arrogance, this kibir.
They argue that a superiority complex, kibir, is often just a hidden inferiority complex, an ashalik complexi. The intense, overwhelming need to project superiority through external religious markers often masks a deep-seated inner emptiness or self-loathing, or the shame of having enslaved yourself to wealth or power rather than being free and responsible.
The mask of piety becomes a defense mechanism against personal ethical failure.
Exactly. And when the prophets Nu and Hud delivered their message, the response from the melee was defined by this toxic combination of arrogance and absolute certainty. They couldn't perceive the truth because their privileged position had completely blinded them.
In the dialogues from the stories of both Nu and Hud, the elite immediately condemned the prophets. They called them sapik, deviant, and safi, foolish or worthless.
But look closely at the language they use. It lacks any doubt whatsoever.
They accused Nu of being in plain sight deviation, apashuk ber sapukluk. There is zero space for akaba. No, maybe. No, what if we are wrong?
This reveals a crucial characteristic of the ignorant and the arrogant. Their certainty is absolute because they have convinced themselves that God is unequivocally, militantly on their side.
God becomes their pocket-sized deity.
A customizable, personal God that they can direct to see or hear only what they themselves wish to validate their own status and actions. They mistake their own self-interest for divine will.
So if that kind of aggressive, absolute certainty defines arrogance, then the spiritual antidote must involve embracing ambiguity, complexity, and adaptation.
Which is why the sources draw our attention to the Quran's use of conscious ambiguity, bilingually mufemlik. The text intentionally leaves certain matters open-ended, sometimes allowing for 4, 5, or even 10 equally valid ways of understanding a concept or a legal detail.
Why would a divine text intentionally be ambiguous? Why not just provide a single definitive answer for everything?
Because the divine law has to govern a diverse, varied, and constantly changing world. Life isn't rigid, it requires adaptation. This ambiguity, therefore, is an essential ease, a kolailuk, intended by God. If the rules were singular and brittle, they would just snap under the weight of global change, or technological advancement, or individual suffering. The flexibility is the mercy.
So the essential focus for you, the listener, has to shift. It has to shift from arguing over those minor legal details, like, for instance, the ancient debate over whether you should wipe or wash your feet during ritual ablution.
The focusing entirely on practical ethics.
Right. Focus on being a more ethical human being, on fostering non-toxic relationships, upholding justice, taking responsibility for the environment. These are the core ethical demands of Taqwa.
Debating endless minutiae, like the specifics of foot washing, it just becomes another layer of ash that's designed to distract us from the core ember.
And that tendency to obsess over rigid, unquestioning custom instead of adaptable ethics, that often leads us back to the deepest form of spiritual stagnation known to humanity.
The prison of the past.
Which brings us to Section 4.
The sources trace the roots of blind traditionalism, this impulse to prioritize the custom of our forebears over current ethical demands, right back to the very earliest stages of human spiritual development. The concept is the Atalar Kultu, the ancestor cult.
And the ancestor cult has the foundation of primitive religions. It arose from a very deep human vulnerability, didn't it? Early humans just couldn't accept the finality of the death of their loved ones.
So they buried them where they lived, they believed the ancestors could remain with them, and they turned those ancestors into immediate, present divine figures to be consulted and worshipped.
This system of localized, physical worship gods in the dirt, gods in the tribe, it persists until the human brain develops the capacity for what the sources call maximum abstraction.
And Tevet, the conception of a transcendent, singular God, requires the human mind to perform the most demanding conceptual abstraction possible, imagining a unified force that is everywhere and nowhere, unbound by place or lineage.
Before that leap to abstraction was possible, humans simply defined any powerful natural phenomenon they couldn't explain as a god.
Right. If lightning struck, it was the lightning god, immediate, physical, localized. The volcano that erupted, the earthquake god that shook the ground.
But as human knowledge, science, philosophy advanced and began to answer the why and the how behind these phenomena,
The number of gods diminished. Knowledge provided clarity, pushing humanity toward unity. And in this narrative, Adam is interpreted not as the first biological man, but as the archetype of the human consciousness that was finally ready for that leap to abstract, singular unity.
We even have concrete archaeological evidence that supports the sophistication and depth of these early practices. The sources touch on the Paleolithic past, noting the Neolithic age began roughly 13,000 years ago, placing the prophet Ibrahim far later, around 2300 BC.
And you just have to look at the cave art, like in Lascaux, dating back 41,000 to 17,000 years ago. These were not crude scrawls. They were aesthetically and technically sophisticated. Picasso's famous comment that he couldn't replicate the skill of the bison drawings suggests a deep level of cultural and spiritual sophistication was already present.
And the interpretation of these sites suggests they were far more than just galleries. They were internal ritual spaces, People would dig trenches and bury beloved objects inside the caves, leaving offerings.
The images were likely not just pictures. They were seen as representations of the animal spirits or souls that they relied on for survival. The power was in the spirit, not in the physical image.
And there's more. The discovery of hallucinogenic gases in some of these caves, across France and sites in Turkey, suggests that these early religious experiences weren't just based on fasting or meditation.
They may have involved altered states of consciousness, perhaps chemically induced, which facilitated the journey toward these perceived animal spirits and ancestor figures. It shows humanity has been actively seeking altered states for spiritual experience for tens of thousands of years.
We can even trace the persistence of these ancient cult practices into much later superstitions. The discovery of sacred beads from sites like Bunkuklu Tarla, dating back 30,000 years, shows an early emphasis on external religious objects.
And we find that ancient priests were buried with their beads, marking them as distinct, whereas common folk are often just thrown into burial pits.
Which indicates the very early formation of a havas, an exclusive, elite class differentiated by perceived spiritual status, symbolized by physical objects. This is the seed of the very Kibir theology we see thousands of years later.
This obsession with external religious identity markers.
All this history leads us back to the core conflict faced by the prophets like Nu and Hud. Why were they truly resisted?
The sources clarify that the people weren't resisting the idea of worshiping a god. They had plenty of gods. They were resisting the call for the worship of only God. Yelnaz Alakaluk.
And the moment they demanded singular worship, they were simultaneously demanding the total rejection of the traditions, the idols, and the spiritual figures of the ancestors.
That was the true point of social and political conflict, because the ancestor cult provides comfort, certainty, and social structure.
Therefore, Tevet, monotheism, unity. It's fundamentally a declaration of freedom.
It is. It demands the rejection of all religious, political, and ideological figures that seek to enslave people. It demands competence, liaquat, and justice, adalet, in place of traditional, unquestioning loyalty to the past or to a ruling caste. It's an ethical revolution.
It's easy to dismiss ancestor worship as purely ancient history, but the sources provide a really powerful, striking, modern example of how catastrophic blind tradition can be, using the case of Japan.
Pre-WWII, Japan provides a chilling case study. Its intense militaristic drive, the atrocities in Manchuria in 1937, the terrifying kamikaze culture where young men found glory in suicidal self-sacrifice, that was directly tied to its deep-seated, unquestioning ancestor cult.
The honor of the ancestors demanded unquestioning submission even to suicidal acts.
Proving the culture was expert at both self-killing and the efficient, disciplined killing of others. But after the devastation of World War II, the country underwent this monumental societal shift. The sources argue they essentially rejected the traditional suffocating culture and the political and priestly class that upheld it.
They enacted a societal, if unspoken, la ilahe, or no God, no idols, mandate against the oppressive, lethal weight of their ancestors' traditions.
And the result is astonishing. Despite moving away from traditional forms of outward piety, they built one of the world's most highly ethical and functional societies. The observations cited in the sources: zero litter in public spaces, a complete lack of aggressive bargaining in business, quiet and orderly traffic flow, even in a metropolis like Tokyo with 32 million people,
are direct outcomes of replacing that blind loyalty with a practical, horizontal responsibility consciousness, with Taqwa.
The core lesson is undeniable. The task is not to carry the ash, the cool of the ancestors' fire, the dead, unquestioning customs, but to carefully carry the ember, the cuz, the living wisdom, the ethical demand, the responsibility consciousness.
And every single companion, every sahab of the prophet, upon accepting the new path, had to make a conscious, painful break and abandon the religion of their own ancestors.
That break from blind traditionalism is the prerequisite for true spiritual growth. To remain alive, to remain wet, as we discussed, you have to be willing to change your most deeply held cultural assumptions.
And that willingness to change, to prioritize ethics over convenience, is what ensures that human systems align with the immutable laws that govern the physical and sociological world, which is our final section.
Section 5. We have to now focus on this concept of immutable divine laws, Sunnatullah. These are fixed, permanent laws established by God, not just in nature, but in history and sociology. And the sources emphasize repeatedly that these laws do not change.
They cite numerous scriptural references to reinforce this. Isra 77, Fatir 43, Azab 62, Fathi 23. This is a crucial foundation. If these laws are immutable, then everything we read about historical events, including so-called divine intervention, has to be interpreted through the lens of those fixed laws.
Precisely. This fundamentally alters how we understand narratives like the flood and blindness. When the sacred texts speak of God destroying a people, it is done through his fixed sociological laws, yasalari lahilakati or not, through some arbitrary magical act.
So the destruction of Nu's people wasn't a punishment arbitrarily dropped from the sky. It was the inevitable sociological result of their own actions violating the laws of justice, resource management, and social cohesion.
They brought about their own ruin by destroying the very foundation of their society. And the sources frame this destruction through the concept of sociological blindness. This is defined as a society drowned in a flood of immorality and alaxis liktufana, but convinced, through their arrogance, that they are merely relaxing comfortably in a luxury pool, protected by their external rituals and their self-proclaimed superiority.
And this psychological state is called blindness, a total inability to perceive reality. They are blind to their sin, blind to the data provided by science and nature, and blind to their own impending self-destruction.
Their Kabir theology has convinced them they are superior and therefore immune to the natural consequences of their actions.
This blindness and arrogance often manifests in the corruption of sacred concepts through literalism and possessiveness. We see this in terms that denote a relationship with God, like Betula, house of God, or Hablula, rope of God.
If we misunderstand these concepts literally, we fall into traps. Is the Beitola the only house God owns? Does he not own the entire universe? These concepts are not about literal ownership. They are about divine relation or governance.
And the most potent example of this corruption is the story of the camel of God, the Nakatula, belonging to the Thamud people.
This was a great civilization in a brutally arid region, Madani Saleh, known for its incredible engineering, including these massive wells up to 15 meters in diameter.
The Prophet Salih presented the camel as a test of their ethical commitment to the collective good. It wasn't just an animal, it was a symbol of shared resource management in a place where water and grass were life itself.
But the people, driven by greed and Kabir, brutally killed the camel. They broke its legs, Fegaruha.
And their arrogance was laid bare in their justification. They refused to share the scarce resources, declaring, if God owns this camel, let God provide for it.
They sought to privatize and control what was meant for the community. Their crime was violating the fundamental ethical and natural law of shared resource management, which led directly to their collective ruin under the law of Sunnatullah.
This moves the lesson beyond just theology and into the realm of universal accountability and measurement. It echoes the Shuaib narrative, which dealt specifically with cheating in trade and weights.
The lesson of Shuaib is not just for merchants. It's a universal law. Do not tamper with the scales or measure dishonestly. And this principle applies not only to the physical meter and the scales we use in the marketplace, but to moral measurement, the scales of the mind, the conscience, and the justice system.
And we are commanded not to let our hatred for any group or enemy lead us to act unjustly toward them. We have to be fair even to our enemies because justice, adil, is stated to be the closest principle, the ultimate expression of taqwa.
And the final injunction, which just rings through time, is this. Do not unjustly take the property of others, and crucially, do not cause corruption, fesat, after order, asla, has been established. Once a society achieves a stable, just equilibrium, once the scales are balanced, deliberately undermining that system for selfish gain is the ultimate transgression against the immutable laws of sociology.
And the sources conclude with painful current examples, showing that these immutable laws concerning justice and corruption are still active today. These are not just ancient histories of Nu and Thamud. These are the current events that prove the sociological laws of decay are still operating.
We see clear case studies of broken trust the moment the scale of integrity is corrupted. Look at the bank manager embezzling funds from the very institution they were tasked with protecting, or the referee or professional football player betting on the exact match they officiate or play in.
These are not random crimes. They are systemic violations of Sunnatullah because trust is the currency of society. When the guardian becomes the thief, the system has to collapse.
The sources highlight the profound psychological damage done to public trust when the symbols of piety themselves are corrupted. The specific, painful example of the pious brother and his covered wife, who, despite their outward appearance of religious commitment, stole 25 kilograms of gold from a secure warehouse.
It brings that washing machine effect into excruciating focus, doesn't it?
It does. They leverage their outward religious identity as a cloak of invisibility. Knowing that their piety would make others assume integrity, thereby facilitating a massive ethical breach. It's a betrayal that damages faith itself in the eyes of the public.
And we see this corruption at the highest levels of governance and justice. The district judiciary official stealing millions, the very person sworn to uphold the moral scales, tampering with him, or the high-ranking bureaucrat whose own signature is literally printed on the national currency notes, caught stealing $100 million from the national treasury.
These individuals are operating under the illusion of the pocket-sized deity, convinced that their position, their political connections, or their outward piety will somehow shield them from the fixed laws of consequence.
But Sunatula is fixed. When trust is destroyed and responsibility, Takva is replaced by arrogance, kabir, social systems collapse, just as surely as an ecosystem dies when its water source is poisoned.
The lesson is sobering. If these are the consistent, repetitive actions of the self-proclaimed mele, the privileged class, then the collapse is not a question of if, but when, because the laws of the universe are immutable.
So this deep dive has meticulously shown us that theological decay is a sociological process. It consistently begins with clinging to cultural customs and misplacing sacred burdens, and it leads to an institutional and societal collapse that's rooted in the arrogance, the kibir of the elite, and the absolute certainty of the ignorant.
The ultimate, synthesizing takeaway from this entire profound body of work is captured in one essential ethical phrase. Religion is for humanity. Din insan isindir. It is meant to serve, to repair, to build, and to improve the quality of human life and culture.
And if that dynamic is reversed, if religion begins to consume people, forcing them to sacrifice their well-being, their critical intellect, or their ethics for the sake of maintaining institutions, sects, temples, or cults,
it stops being a spiritual guide and becomes, in the source's terrifying categorization, a cannibal religion, a yam din. True spirituality exists to expand human freedom and responsibility.
So let us internalize the immutability of these laws, our evil, our arrogance, our corruption. They don't harm the Lord of the worlds whose existence is eternal. They harm us, and they destroy the social culture we desperately need to survive.
The ultimate question for you to consider, based on everything we've unpacked today, is this. How have you, in your own daily life, been complicit in creating a pocket-sized God deity tailored to see only what you want him to see, thereby avoiding the profound, challenging demands of true Takva?
Until the next deep dive, stay safe, stay curious, and keep learning.